In the previous two sections, we learned about some advanced forms of assessments, namely the case study assessments and gamified assessments. We discussed how to create them, how to use them for the iGOT platform, and also the advantages and disadvantages of each of them. Throughout the course, we have discussed at length how to create different types of questions and the best practices to keep in mind so that the questions created are effective and of high quality. In the final section of this course, we will review some of the best practices and methods learned over the 8 modules for creating effective assessments. The following practices must be borne in mind while creating any assessment. The aim of doing this is to ensure that the assessments created meet the learning objectives accurately. Let's begin by listing down these practices. First, clearly state your educational objective and develop a table of specifications. The objectives and the assessment must be clearly defined. This will help the assessment creator to frame appropriate questions and also prepare the learner. Second, develop assessment procedures that are appropriate for measuring the learning outcomes specified in the previous step. This means that we should select assessment methods or tools appropriately. For example, a match the following question would not be appropriate to assess decision making. A case study would be better for this specific objective. Thus, selection of assessment methods should be done in line with the assessment objectives. Third, develop scoring criteria explicitly. The learners should be made aware of the scoring criteria. This step helps clarify expectations of the assessment creators, and the learners can prepare and expect marks or results accordingly. For example, the minimum number of marks required to obtain the certification of the courses should be communicated in advance. The learners can then prepare accordingly. Fourth, develop clear guidelines for test administration. As discussed, while learning how to create match the following questions, instructions should be clearly defined. Instructions on how many questions to attempt, the time limit if any, etc. are some points that we as assessment creators otherwise might miss. Provide information to the learners about the assessment before administering it. The time they have, the marking pattern to be followed, and any negative marking on the assessment. This also saves time for the learners from any confusion that might arise due to lack of clear instructions. Fifth, be sensitive to the diversity of the learners. All the assessments created must be inclusive in nature. We must make provisions for a variety of learners, for those with disabilities and special needs. In addition, we must also be mindful about the target audience social background, language barriers, etc., and frame questions and examples that are inclusive and are respectful of that. Sixth, review assessments prior to administration. Repeated revisions of the assessments to match the objectives of the assessment will prove to be a good exercise in creating quality assessments. Seventh, create a detailed answer key as you create the questions. This would also mean listing down why some of the answers are incorrect. For example, in an MCQ, you should know why one option is the correct answer. You should also list out why the other options are incorrect. The same should also be done with other tools such as fill in the blanks for obvious incorrect answers. Eighth, do a pilot assessment before the actual assessment. The best way to review the assessments you have created is by getting someone who wasn't involved with assessment creation to take the assessments. Based on how he or she does on the assessment, you will be able to judge aspects like difficulty level of questions, clarity of instructions, and understand if the learning objectives have been met or not. Ninth, ensure assessments are scored fairly and properly based on the set criteria. We have discussed at length the various scoring methods and how to reduce bias in scoring assessments. In order to retain accountability of assessments, we must ensure that scoring is done appropriately in a fair manner. The next 2 points pertain to the framing of questions. 10th, keep the questions in simple language to avoid extra reading. The questions should be easy to comprehend and understand. 11th, avoid using negatives like not while framing questions. Use of negatives only adds to confusion in understanding the question. 12th, finally, try to make the assessments engaging for the audience. Keeping in mind the target audience, we must create questions in such a way that the learners enjoy solving the assessments. For example, use a variety of colors for students or make the questions slightly challenging for adults, or use interesting examples or stories for the questions. Let us summarize what we all learnt in this final module. First, we learnt about the limitations of traditional assessment strategies. These included practical application of course knowledge cannot be assessed or practiced, challenges associated with lack of engagement in the assessment. Next, we learned how to create 2 advanced forms of assessments. These were case studies assessments, gamified assessments. Finally, we reviewed some best practices developed over the entire course for creating any assessment.